The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you and enjoy. It's been quite a few years now, but a long time ago, probably about 15 years or so, I was putting together a conference called Change Yourself, Change the World, about spiritual practice and activism in the world. And I'd always heard about this guy named Bo Lozoff. You may have heard of him. He wrote a book called We're All Doing Time. He was one of the first people to bring meditation into jails where people were incarcerated. He developed a project called the Ashram Prison Project. That really was the beginning of a lot of work, really transformative work in the world. And so I arranged to call him, and I was outlining what the conference was and what he would do and how much we would pay him. And he said, well, this sounds really interesting, but I'm really going to mess with your system. I said, well, what's that? He said, I'll only do this with Donna. And I thought, well, I don't know who Donna is, but hell, bring her along, you know. I'm so glad he didn't say that, because I found out Dana is the Pali word for generosity. The word dana is to give and receive fully, which is a real important tenet in our practice. And so he agreed to come, but only if the conference we offered was freely available to all, and all by donation. I was really intrigued, and I asked him more, and his whole community down in North Carolina was all run on the principle of donation. That everything was offered freely, and referencing the Buddha's teachings was saying that the teachings and the practices are priceless. You cannot put a price on the value. So therefore, there shouldn't be a price. It should all be offered freely. So in a lot of the Asian cultures, generosity is very much a part of the fabric of the culture. When you see the monks doing their alms rounds, the little kids, before they can even walk, they're putting in their little handful of rice a little sticky rice into the bowl. And it's very much a part of that culture. But he said how their community, that they were just beginning down to fumes, and then someone would make a donation. And I thought, that sounds like a really, really scary way to make a living. But I was also really, really intrigued by it. And I just thought, I really want to do that someday. And it's been a fascinating experiment, as this class is offered in that spirit, that it's freely available, and I'm really, really touched by the practice. So I wanted to talk about this principle of generosity, why it's so important. I think it's timely for this time of year when we're called on being more generous. I ran across this, by the way, a great tip for saving money at Christmas, especially if you have extended family. At Thanksgiving, be sure to bring up politics. It's interesting when you look through the lens of Buddhist psychology. Oftentimes there's the metaphor of the Buddha as a doctor. First there's finding the issue, clarifying the issue, and then diagnosing the cause, and then prescribing the treatment. I'd like to follow a little bit of that theme in this talk. And the issue being kind of the closed heart that we oftentimes find ourselves in, and diagnosing the cause of that. And then how we can begin to explore what it's like to actively cultivate generosity in the world. There's a story that has two endings. I'm going to tell you one ending first. It's the story of two brothers who shared land that they inherited, and one brother was single, the other had a large family, and they had their grain bins in their separate little barns. And one brother thought, my other brother has got all these kids, is going to take care of them. I got no one to take care of me. And the other brother was thinking, I've got all these mouths to feed. My brother's only got himself. So every night they would sneak across the field and take a pail of grain from the other's bin and bring it back. And they couldn't understand why it always stayed the same. And then one night they met in the middle of the field and realized what was going on, and then became kind of bitter enemies after that. And we all have that experience of feeling lack, feeling like we're taking advantage of, but there's not enough. And when we live from that place, life gets very, very small. And I would imagine we've all had that experience. Someone's taking advantage of me. We create the other, and then we're threatened by the other. And I think we're seeing it in our culture right now, as we can sort of see kind of the shadow side of our culture coming forward, of people very suspicious of the other. I think it may be tied into our aging population. As we age, we're more concerned about preserving what we have and afraid it might be taken away. I actually am noticing that now I'll actually see an article where the title was there. I never paid any attention to it before, but now when I see the 5 mistakes people make when they think of retiring, now I'm reading that article. So what happens is when you begin to look at what it means to be generous, it actually amplifies where you're not generous. Because in that same way, when you're practicing mindfulness and meditation, you're focusing on being present, which automatically amplifies how you're not present. You can see all the patterns and the conditioning you have that take you out of being here and now. And when you focus on the heart practices, it amplifies your wounds and your pettiness and your self-preservation. So it's a really powerful practice to really look at your relationship to generosity. And it's something that I really haven't figured out for myself. Am I being generous enough? Should I be sharing more of what I have? Or is it a responsible thing to do to make sure that I have enough so that I won't have needs in the future? Where's the wise path in cultivating what it means to live a generous life? There's another story of someone who's kind of a classic. I imagine many of us know this one. Of someone who's kind of asked to be given a tour of heaven. And they're shown this room where people have these long spoons, and they're feeding each other across the table, really carefully. And then they ask to see hell. And what they see is people with the same long spoons trying to feed themselves, but the spoon is too long. And that is kind of a hell realm. When we live in that much of a sense of fear and self-preservation, we cut ourselves off from what it really means to be in relationship. And we're really driven by that. We want to make sure the world knows that we're right, which means everyone else has got to be wrong unless they agree with us. I was reminded of this great scene. You ever see the movie Breaking Away? It's an old independent movie from a long time, and the father was really upset with his son. It was just kind of this kind of crazy artistic guy, and did something to punish him, and his son just broke down crying, really just miserable tears. And the father said, well, I wanted you to be miserable, but not this miserable. That's kind of what we inflict on each other. So there have been some really interesting studies that have been done on generosity, like what gets in the way of being generous and what you can do to actually cultivate more of a sense of generosity. And they use this thing in this, I didn't realize this is kind of one of the standard things they do. It's called the dictator game that you play. In each round of the game, participants were given $10 and asked how much of that $10 they would choose to keep and how much they would give to a stranger, identified in a headshot, a name, and income level. Participants were told that for a random selection of rounds, real money would be distributed as they selected, and they played the dictator game anonymously to ensure they weren't trying to impress the experimenters with their generosity. And what they found was a lot of what gets in the way is the lack of what's called neural empathy. That when you could sense the pain in another person and you could relate to it, that would prompt generosity. But what they noticed was that what also gets in the way of generosity is a natural inborn prejudice. We empathize with people who look like us. We empathize with people who we relate to. So when we see someone suffering and we can relate to them, we relate to them individually. When we see someone who doesn't look like us or we perceive as the other, we think of them as a whole and not as individual. And this, of course, is a big part of how we separate ourselves as we create others. And the exceptions to this, of course, are when we actually have real experiences of the other, that then again we make that neural connection, and then we can begin to cross that pathway of sensing another person's suffering and then responding to it. The other thing that gets in the way of being generous is when we sense suffering, but there's no identifiable victim. And I had mentioned this before, that there was this one study where there was a catastrophe somewhere in the world, and they sent out letters of appeal. And in one letter they talked about how bad the whole situation was in kind of broad terms. Another one they talked about the economic impact. In another they showed a picture of one girl and they told her story. And guess which one received all of the attention? Because we could identify with that one person. And I thought this was interesting, that again, there's this sense of neural empathy, being able to connect with someone who we really perceive as a victim of suffering. And this study said that one of the big obstacles to empathy is adolescence. And they've actually done a lot of studies of how as the brain develops, there is a very natural kind of, if you've ever been around an adolescent or if you've ever been one, you can relate to kind of like the inherent narcissism. And actually, as adolescents age, there is a natural expansion of generosity because their neural pathways open up and they can begin to sense others. So it's very interesting how our lack of generosity is very much tied into a sense of a very small, confined self. Usually there's some sense of fear that something will be taken away from us, and so we kind of hold on tight. One of the very first teachings that the Buddha offered was about generosity as one of the main principles of the practice. And it was very much based on his own experience. And again, who knows how much of this is mythology or allegory. But after all the arduous exploration he did in his practice, when the final craving and aversion fell away, and there was like this awakened state, he felt no intention or desire to share it or teach it. At first, there was just the sense of, kind of being fully awakened, if you will. But then there was this sense of like, no one's going to get this. No one can get this. And then there was an impulse when he actually thought, and part of the translation, as I understand it, from like the original text, where he thought about the friends he had practiced with. And he said, well, there are a few people who have only a little bit of dust in their eyes. So then he began to share his teachings with just those few people. And one of the things he said was, if people knew, as I know, the results of giving and sharing, they would not eat without having given, nor would the stain of selfishness overcome their minds. Even if it were their last bite, their last mouthful, they would not eat without having shared if there was someone to receive their gift. So that's a really interesting offering. That if you knew what I know, you would never hesitate to share. Why would that be? Like, what does that point toward? And I think what it points toward is the dissolution of that small self and the opening into something larger. I think about my grandfather a lot. He died when I was maybe 7 or 8. And a really wild life. He grew up on a farm in southern Illinois, speaking only German. And his father had fought in the Civil War as a mercenary and had 5 kids and then died. So they were very, very poor. And when he was 5, his mother sort of gave him to another neighbor where he lived in the barn watching the cows. And that was his early life. And he went on to put himself through college and through engineering school and became an engineer and did really, really well. And he also left behind enough money for me to go to private high school and through college. And when I look back on what that gift provided for me, it opened up an unimaginable world for me. If I hadn't had that gift, I don't know what my life would be like. And that's very much a part of my awareness of how that one act of generosity, how much that changed my life. And it sort of changed my life in the same way that I'm trying to do the same for my nieces and my nephews, to make it easier for them to pursue what they want to pursue. But it's a really powerful reflection to take some time to reflect on how you have perhaps been the recipient of some generosity. So why don't we take a few moments for this? If you like, you can close your eyes. You might just take some time just to feel your breath. And one natural doorway into this reflection is just to think of one thing that you're grateful for. Just one thing that you appreciate in your life. And you might just say hello to that. And then again, what do you appreciate? What are you most grateful for in your life right now? What comes to mind in that question? And then again, can you think of someone or something that you're grateful for? That showed you some kindness or thoughtfulness or looked out for you. And you might just gently lengthen and deepen your breath and just again say hello to how you have been blessed in this life. And you might just sense what this feels like, just this cumulative reflection on gratitude. And then if you like, you can lengthen the breath. You can open the eyes or feel free to remain with them closed. And gratitude and appreciation is one of the most profound ways to change your state. What I find is it moves me from a sense of self-centeredness to a much more open, kind of porous state of consciousness. And when we reflect on the generosity that we've received, it has a way of kind of steeping ourselves in that possibility of being generous to others as well. So the Buddha talked about these qualities of, it's not the right word, but they're referred to as the perfections, kind of like the realized states that kind of go into being like fully awake in your life. And the very first one he talks about is generosity. Kind of this stance of being open and present. Some of the others are kind of ethical self-discipline, like really knowing how to focus your attention, patience and perseverance, and cultivating mental stability through concentration, and then cultivating discriminating attention or wisdom. But the foundation is generosity. So here are a couple of reasons why they're important. One of them is referred to as karmic benefits. Every action has an equal reaction. So if you act in generosity, you are putting into a chain into effect of generosity. I heard this great story. Today, after almost 5 years after I stopped volunteering at the suicide prevention hotline, the new manager gave me a call. She said this afternoon they received a $25,000 anonymous donation to help fund the support line. Along with the donation, they received an email that read, "Thank you, Claire. You saved my life." Apparently, I'm the only Claire who ever volunteered there. That just gives me goosebumps. We cannot measure the impact of a generous act. So there's an interesting thing here of how if you are generous to others, chances are that people will be generous to you. There's a story of this old man with his son who's by the gates of a city, and this guy comes from far, far away. He said, "I come from over those mountains, and what are the people like here in this city?" And the old man says, "Well, what were they like where you're from?" He said, they were nasty, cheating, horrible people. And the old man said, well, I think you'll find that's what they're like here. And then a little later, another person comes, well, I come from those mountains over there. He goes, what are the people like in this town? Well, what were they like where you came from? He said, they were just the kindest, most thoughtful and generous people. He said, I think you're going to find those kind of people here. We create through our actions. There's an interesting thing of how, because there's some controversy in the mythology of the Buddha, because he left a wife and child to pursue his practice, but also that he had enough wealth in order to do that they were cared for while he was able to do that. And it's an interesting treatise on how poverty is not necessarily a higher state. That actually the Buddha talked quite extensively of having the means, the means to be at ease, the means to care for others, the means to provide for others, is a very, very important part of living a wholesome life in the world. So the other thing the Buddha talked about was, well, what are the spiritual benefits of generosity? And in essence, you can think of it this way, that the practice is about letting go of two things. It's about letting go of aversion, of anger, judgment, ill will, blame, hatred. And it's about letting go of craving, letting go of wanting. In the absence of wanting things to be different and the aversion toward what's here, what are you left with? You're left with a sense of presence. You're left with that non-judging presence. So what happens is, generosity is a way of directly moving against that quality of tightening around a sense of self. So it becomes a practice that actually changes your brain. It changes your nervous system. And we're finding this in all these amazing studies. It's actually training in awakening of letting go of the self, because it really eliminates greed and it eliminates ill will. When you give away what's valuable, you are reducing your attachments. And when you give your time to others, it develops altruism, which is a profound conditioning for the mind. It's conditioning your mind to let go, because ultimately it has to let go of everything. So another reason why we give is for the joy of creating benefit for others. Another little story. Today, while standing in line at the store, my 9-year-old daughter asked for a candy bar. After saying no twice, I gave in. I paid, and as we walked away, I gave it to her. She stopped, turned around, and handed it to a little boy that was crying in line behind us at the register. I asked her why she gave it to him, and she said she heard the boy's mom tell him that they didn't have money for candy until she could find another job. That's what happens when we let ourselves really feel the pain of others, that natural, unfettered response to suffering. And the classic story is that, we think that we're just a wave lost on the ocean. And that's kind of what selfishness is. I'm just this lonely little wave on the ocean. What generosity does is it reminds you that you are a wave and you are the ocean at the same time. And so it becomes this practice of really tuning ourselves in to be more aware of those who are less fortunate than ourselves. And that's a tricky business, because sometimes it can be overwhelming. There's There's something known as compassion fatigue, which is really certified. You can actually be overwhelmed, by the suffering around you. But at the same time, to be aware of it can be so powerful and so helpful. In the community where I lived, we really took on the idea of seva, S-E-V-A, which the translation is selfless service. It's about getting yourself out of the way when you are serving another person. And the phrase in the ashram where I lived, it's Aditi Devo Bhava, which is translated as the guest is God. It's the practice of whoever is in front of you is the manifestation of the divine. And can you explore what that's like? So in our ashram, we had many people come and visit, and so that was our practice, was like, everyone in front of you is a manifestation of God. How can you respond in a way that really enlivens that sense? So listening to that sense of where the need is, why don't we do a short little reflection? And again, you might bring your awareness to the breath. And just as a little exercise, you might bring into mind someone in your life who might be struggling right now. Someone who might be going through a hard time. And when you have someone in mind, you might just take a moment to sense, how do you imagine they are feeling right now? And when you begin to tune in to the unmet need, is there a sense of what they're wanting or what they're needing in their life right now? And you might sense, if you were to cultivate just a generous offering toward them, what might you offer? It might be to offer them well-wishing. It might be to reach out. And you might sense, if you were to make a generous act, whether it be through thought or speech or action, what would that feel like inside? What would that be like? And again, you might deepen the breath. And if you like, you can let your eyes open. Or you can remain with them closed. And so this becomes a question of, how do we relate to the world in a way that moves us away from a self-protecting sense of self and opens us to a sense of a more expanded sense of self. Another little story. Today, my direct supervisor got a promotion, and instead of accepting the full $1 an hour raise that went with it, she requested to split the total raise 50-50 with me, since I was her hardest worker and hadn't gotten the raise in the past year due to budget cuts. Just those little things. And are you familiar with the 5 languages of love? It's such a powerful little thing. Just a little quick overview. We tend to give and receive love in the ways that we like to receive love. And when we're in relationship with other people, oftentimes they like to receive love a different way than we like to. So the 5 ways that we tend to, where we receive love, one is through words of affirmation, one is through touch, one is through quality time, one is through gifts, and one is through acts of service. If you haven't had this conversation with the people closest into you, you've got to have this conversation because it's really, really mind-blowing. So when I had this conversation with my wife, gifts mean nothing to her, thank God. I just hate the pressure. You know what it's like to find a gift for someone who they don't know that they need it, but it's exactly the thing they need? That's performance anxiety. I can't take it. She appreciates touch and affirmation, but quality time, eyeball to eyeball, let's talk this through, that is like nectar for her. And for me, being, the third out of 4 kids, and, when I realized at 7, if I don't have any needs, I will not have any problem in this life. For me, it's acts of service. So when my wife makes a bowl of food for me at noon, it's like, I can't believe someone just did this for me. It's an extraordinary thing. So have that conversation if you haven't had it, because it's really, really rich. Because quite often, how you most receive love will be through some vulnerable doorway, because it's usually the thing you didn't really get. And when you can begin to recognize that when the people around you, the close-in people around you, when they're out of balance, when you're tuned in to their love language, it just goes straight to it. It's so satisfying. And I think that's kind of what this life is all about really just sensing our capacity to respond in ways that most resonate for the world around us. So it's one thing to think of really helpful to think of a call to action. When you think about those who are struggling around you, is there something that you can do that might just push the envelope? To call someone who might be going through a hard time and let them know you're thinking about them. Or just to send a note of gratitude to someone. Those are the little practices that they seem small, but they're ways that we can sense the possibility of expanding ourselves and being more in relationship with the world around us. So I told the story of the 2 brothers. Here's the alternate ending. So 2 brothers have inherited a farm from their father. One has no children, the other has many children. One brother thinks, I have so much grain, I'm here alone. My brother has all these little mouths to feed. And the other brother thinks, I've got all these kids to take care of me when I get old. My brother has no one. And so they each take a pail of grain and they put it in each other's barn, and they can't figure out why they have the same amount of grain. And one night, they bump into each other, and they embrace. Let's close with a short little reflection. We'll take the next few minutes in silence. As we close, just to take a few moments to reflect on how blessed you are. All the acts of generosity that you have accumulated. And in your own way, wishing all beings ease and well-being. May all beings in all directions feel safe and free from suffering.